We are live. Hey, chat, can you let me know if you can hear me? And we are live. Hey. Hey everyone, welcome. We're doing episode 13 of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, watch party and discussion of John Vervaeke's lecture series. This one's about Buddhism and Parasitic Processing. Patrick in the chat says this is an interesting one and he's looking forward to the discussion, so I'm looking forward to this too. We do these watch parties every 9 a.m. PST, 5 p.m. GMT. Discussion is 1 hour later. I'll give a Zoom link around that time, and then you guys can jump in. Also, Yuvi is doing the show notes, and you can check those out. It's a Google Doc, and you can check that out at futurethinkers.org/meaningcrisisnotes. I think that's everything. We can probably get into it.
Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So last time what we did is we finished up a cognitive scientific exploration of higher states of consciousness, awakening experiences, these kinds of mystical experiences that bring about massive transformation. We saw how we can give a psychologically adequate description of these processes that explain both the experiential profile that people are having and some of the features that they find therein. We were also able to talk about this at the level of machine learning and information processing and at the brain level. And what comes out of this is a picture of a state of consciousness in which we are getting a flow state that is improving our optimal grip on the world, optimizing our performance for making sense of things, and enhancing our overall capacity for learning and problem solving. And we saw that that, in fact, provides a very good justification for these states being the guidance for the transformation of life, in that what they do is they give a brain state that is highly optimized, processing things in a way that gives us a tremendous sense of a plausible grip on the world, and that is making use of processing that is absolutely indispensable and foundational for us. It has a kind of important priority in all of our processing. And what I suggested from this is that while it doesn't give us any good theories in the sense of propositional claims about the metaphysical structure of reality, these states do justify their claim to give us guidance. So although they are not rational in the sense of providing good argument and evidence for beliefs, they are rational in the sense of wisdom, in that they optimize some of our core processing for being in contact with the reality in a way that is coupled optimally to our own processes of self-transcendence and the cultivation of wisdom. So the Buddha awakens, and that awakening gives him this state that is guiding him to a fundamental transformation in how he understands the world and how he understands, not just intellectually, because that's what I've been contrasting here, but in a participatory fashion, in an existential fashion, himself and the world. We talked about how this is bringing about a sati, a deep remembering of the being mode, so that he is seeing through the frustrating futility of modal confusion. But there is more that's going on. This higher state of consciousness is not only helping him remember the being mode and helping him to transcend through systematic illusion and go through something deeply analogous to a developmental shift. We can also see it in terms, we can see what's going on in his claim to enlightenment and its relevance to the cultivation of wisdom and the enhancement of meaning in terms of the pronouncements he made from this state. Now, talking about this is very problematic because the attempts by the West to understand some of the central tenets of Buddhism has not had a very good history. I recommend to you Stephen Batchelor's book, Awakening the West, for how the West has systematically misunderstood. And Batchelor makes a current argument in a series of his books. I've got to meet Stephen at a conference, and we had dinner together. I recommend all of his works very strongly and very highly to you. And so from his works and in discussion with him, he argues that the West is still in the grip of a problematic way of trying to interpret Buddhism. So let's take a quick look at that, and then we will return to what the central claims of Buddhism are. And I want to show you why even that way of putting it is perhaps incorrect. So Batchelor, in one of his books, along with others, and he follows it up with Buddhism Without Beliefs, and then later on this is followed up by even a more radical After Buddhism, in which he's taking the position of somebody who's post-religious, very germane to many of us. But he does argue, and along with others, that we face an interpretation crisis when we're trying to understand Buddhism. We have two approaches that people give us for how we should try and interpret Buddhism. Of course, this will not be relevant just to Buddhism, but for any position that exists in a different culture or history that we're trying to understand, be it Buddhism or Stoicism or Neoplatonism, for example. So he says we are confronted with two different positions. One is the claim that you can only interpret Buddhism from within a tradition, and we've seen good reason why you might argue that this is, right, the kind of stuff we're talking about here, wisdom and self-transcendence. This is not largely a matter of altering your belief. This is about going through transformation in your perspectival and participatory knowing. It's about fundamentally altering the agent-arena relationship, your existential modes, etc. And so if you are not engaged within the transformative practice, then, of course, you do not understand what Buddhism is. It has to, in that sense, be understood from within. And this is a general property of wisdom per se. Wisdom is something that must be understood from within. The problem with that, of course, is it's myopic. Right? There are very many Buddhist traditions, and they are relative to certain times and place in particular historical contexts. And to claim that that particular interpretation, a particular sect or tradition is the sole pathway to understanding or interpreting Buddhism is, of course, myopic. It's narrow-minded and often parochial. It claims things as fundamental, which are often very contingent. So, what's the alternative? The alternative is, well, what the alternative says is, the problem with this is very subjective. I don't know if that's exactly the right word, but the idea here is, right, this is, the problem with seeing things from the inside is that tends to be very subjective, and of course that means you're not understanding the phenomena as is, but you're only seeing it through your own particular bias. So the alternative, outside any tradition, and this is typified in the academic study of Buddhism, for example, like within religious studies, or something like that. And then the main argument here is, and this will often happen, it's not always the case, but if you meet people in religious studies and you'll say, are you studying Buddhism? And they'll say, yes, I'm studying Buddhism. And then you'll ask them, well, what practices do you engage in? And they'll say, oh, no, I don't engage in any practices. That would be a mistake. If I got too involved, too close to this material, I would lose my objectivity. I would lose my ability to critically reflect on it, critically compare it to other traditions, other approaches. So the idea here is what we will have, right, is an objective account. Now, although Stephen doesn't mention this in his book, Batchelor, Stephen Batchelor doesn't mention it in his book, this is very reminiscent of the problem that Socrates faced. Because what we have here is transformative relevance, and here we have some attempt to get at the truth. And like the Socratic project, I would put it to you, and this is what I think Batchelor is saying, is that Buddhism is about both of these. It's about trying to find transformatively relevant truths. But that means we have to transcend both of these ways of interpreting Buddhism. So he points out that we have to get beyond both of these in some fashion. How do we do this? Well, he points out that we need to do this in a way that is going to be relevant to issues of meaning in our life. So this interpretation crisis, where we have these two competing and diametrically opposed ways of trying to interpret and import Buddhism, is actually interacting with the meaning crisis in society. Because we're not doing this just in some empty cultural vacuum. We are precisely interested, as I've been suggesting throughout this series of lectures, we're doing this precisely because we're deeply involved with the project of trying to recover how we can cultivate wisdom and enhance meaning in our lives in a cultural historical context that is not supportive and is in fact often deleterious to those existentially necessary endeavors. Okay, so what do? We have to break out of all of this in some fashion. And what he does is he tries to see where these are both fixated. And what he argues is that this will become myopic because it will get fixated on the particular propositions of a tradition. It will get fixated on beliefs. And this is in fact what you study over here objectively. You study, of course, the texts and the beliefs that have been propositionally rendered by a particular tradition. It's this belief fixation that needs to be broken through. This is why he entitles the book that came after Alone with Others, Buddhism Without Beliefs, because he tries to argue that part of what is preventing us from really getting both sides of Buddhism is that both of these are fixed, locked, like being locked inside the box in the 9-dot problem, on trying to understand Buddhism as a set of beliefs. We have gotten so used to this way of thinking, and we'll see later why it is a post-Christian way of thinking, that these traditions these axial legacy traditions for cultivating wisdom and self-transcendence are to be understood as creeds, as systems of beliefs that we now even will equate, right, the word belief with these practices. We'll talk about it as a belief system, or we'll even use the word belief as a synonym for faith, etc. So we have gotten so oriented towards this reduction of all of what we've been talking about here, all of this transformational process to the possession and the assertion of beliefs, and again we'll see historically why that's the case, that we can't break out of this. Interestingly, although I won't be able to do it in this video, we're going to see that breaking out of, right, trying to understand meaning in terms of belief systems is also going to be needed to address the meaning crisis. I have been pointing you towards that repeatedly. Belief systems, namely ideologies, are attempts to create meaning, but they fail for the deep reason, and you've already seen a lot of argument and evidence for this, is that a lot of your meaning-making machinery is not occurring at the level of your propositional knowledge, your beliefs, and your assertions of which beliefs you adhere to. So he proposes instead what we need to do is we need to look at Buddhism ultimately existentially. Now you remember existentially has to do with these modes. He also invokes in Alone with Others the distinction between the being mode and the having mode, and he proposes that Buddhism is remembering the being mode, and I've already talked about that in a previous video. And so he says, look, traditionally what the Buddha said, and now we're returning to what the Buddha said is in order to try and get more of what his enlightenment was about. Traditionally what the Buddha said is presented as the Four Noble Truths. And these are four statements or propositions that are usually presented to our ears as claims to be believed. And that what makes you a Buddhist is if you believe them. The problem with this, of course, is that it is taking place at this very level that Batchelor argues we need to get beyond. It's not, of course, that people don't believe things within Buddhism. It's that what we've been talking about here, these processes of transformation, are taking place at the level of perspectival knowing, at the level of transforming of states of consciousness, and at the participatory level, transforming the fundamental machinery of the self, of the agent-arena relationship, and the modes of existence. So we need to understand these Four Noble Truths as things that could help afford the kind of transformations we've been talking about. The point about these is not to believe them. The point about them is to get them to help you reenact the Buddha's enlightenment. If you're not doing that, if you cannot enact enlightenment, then you are not getting The Four Noble Truths. He proposes, therefore, that we should not call them the Four Noble Truths, we should call them the Four Ennobling Truths. I then proposed to him in person that we shouldn't even call them truths anymore, because truth is a property of propositions. Actually, I said what you should call them is the Four Ennobling Provocations. You're trying to provoke people into change. So let me try and go through the Four Noble Truths, but restating them as four enabling, that means affording self-transcendence, provocations. By doing that, I think we can get back to, if that's the right verb, what the Buddha was conveying about what's going on in enlightenment. What kind of transformation is being brought about by the awakening experience? And what is it alleviating? Okay, so let's go through these one by one. Okay, so I'll present the standard way of representing the truth and then the reformulation in order to deal with Batchelor's, I think, astute criticism, and in order to interconnect with all the argumentation we have been developing throughout this video series. So the first one is typically stated as all is suffering, or all of life is suffering. Now, that's, first of all, if that were the statement to be believed, it's false. Because suffering is a comparative term, and comparative terms can't be extended to everything. That would be like saying everything is tall. It doesn't make any sense. Things are only tall relative to other things being shorter. So, first of all, it doesn't really mean all is. It's something more like all is threatened by. Well, what's the all? Does it mean everything in existence? Should we interpret it metaphysically? Well, I mentioned last time that we should be careful about giving metaphysical interpretations to what people bring out of these awakening experiences. And the Buddha himself was famously reticent to give any metaphysical interpretations to his statements. So let's try and follow that. In order to get at that, let's note what this word means. Okay? Because again, we've tended to allow a word to go through a process of trivialization and reduction, and we've lost part of the meaning. Let me give you, first of all, an analogy. Okay, so the original meaning of this word is insane. But it has come to be synonymous with angry. I'm mad at Agnes. Doesn't mean I'm insane, right? It means that I'm angry at Agnes. How did that happen? Well, one of the ideas is anger is a state that can render you, if it becomes extreme anger can render you temporarily insane, and therefore temporarily mad. Anger is a cause, a pertinent cause of madness. Okay, so suffering, people usually hear pain, distress when they hear the word suffering. That person is suffering. But that's not actually what the word means. To suffer means to undergo. It means to lose agency. So you can actually suffer joy. You can have so much joy that you sort of have lost control of yourself. You can have so much pleasure. It is not oxymoronic to say, I'm suffering pleasure. It means I'm having so much pleasure that I've sort of lost control of the situation, right? Now, pain is a very powerful way of losing agency. Why? First of all, it's highly disruptive. And secondly, pain is associated usually with damage, and damage is a state in which we're often losing agency. So, right? Don't hear just pain. The Buddha is not saying everything's painful. That's ridiculous, because if everything was painful, nothing would be painful. Even all of your experiences can be painful. Doesn't mean anything particular, because many of your experiences can't be painful in and of themselves, right? Because again, this isn't an absolute kind of claim. Instead, pay attention to this connection rather than this one. Do you remember? Last video gave a parable of this suffering. It's the monkey that grabs the pitch and then tries to free itself, and then the other hand gets stuck in both paws and head, and then it gets killed. There's nothing in there of pain. Most of the Buddha's metaphors are not pain metaphors, they're entrapment metaphors. Being fettered, losing your freedom, losing your agency. That's why the Buddha doesn't describe enlightenment in terms of relief, but he would famously say, just like wherever you dip into the ocean, it has one taste, the taste of salt. No matter where you dip into my teaching, it has one taste, the taste of freedom. Okay? So what he seems to be saying is that all of your life is threatened with the possibility of losing your freedom. So let's go from all is suffering to a provocation. Realize that all of your life is threatened with a loss of freedom, a loss of agency. And there's a word for this kind of loss that's often translated as suffering, which is dukkha. Dukkha, again, does not mean pain. What does dukkha mean? Well, the etymology is, imagine you have a wheel, and it's off-center on its axis. So the axle is not properly going through the center of the wheel, and as the wheel is turning, it's destroying itself. So there's a self-destructiveness. Or you have, your arm is out of joint, it's disjointed, like when Shakespeare has, Hamlet says, the time is out of joint, right? It's out of joint, and as you're moving your arm, it's destroying itself. So it means like an empty gap that's sort of dirty, so that as things are moving within it, they're destroying themselves. So the idea of something that's engaged in a process of self-destruction, which of course is one of the powerful ways you can lose your agency, is through self-destructive processes, is what's going on here. So realize that all of your life is threatened, very really threatened, existentially threatened, by a capacity for self-destructive behavior. Self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. So now you see what he's doing is so situated very firmly within the axial tradition. So what does he mean here? How can we try and understand this a little bit better? So this is work based on some stuff I've published with Leo Ferraro, and then I'll talk about some additional and important new work by Mark Lewis. I want to try and trace a kind of pattern in your cognitive processing that can very often occur. And the core of the argument I want to make is the very processes that make you adaptively intelligent, and we've been talking about this from the beginning, also make you vulnerable to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. Okay, so let's say you encounter an event and you interpret the event as bad. Okay. Now, one of the adaptive machines you have is your brain immediately is trying to predict and anticipate other events like that. The point of, right, you encountering something potentially even painful or distressing is not just to, it's to make you sensitive in anticipating what's going to happen in the future. Okay, so your brain now tries to assess the probability of another event like this happening. Now, we'll get into this in more detail later, although we've talked a bit about it already with ideas about salience, right? Is I can't take in all of the information available to me. If I was to try and calculate the actual probability of an event, I would have to track all the variables in my environment. That's astronomically vast. Even a supercomputer cannot possibly do this. Right? The thing is, when we do probability problems in school, we are given all the variables by stipulation. But the real world doesn't work that way. The real world has an indefinitely large set of variables interacting in an indefinitely large number of ways. So what do? Well, we use what are called heuristics. We use shortcuts that try and help us cut through and zero in on the relevant data, the relevant information. As we've said before, this zeroing in on relevant information is crucial. So one of the things we do is we use the representativeness heuristic. Right? You judge how probable an event is by how prototypical it is, how salient it is, how much it stands out in your mind. Right? And that will often interact with another heuristic, the availability heuristic. This is you judge how probable an event is by how easy you can remember a similar event occurring, or how easily you can imagine another event occurring. So these are actually very adaptive for you. Now the problem is you're in a bad state because you've just had something bad happen to you. Now that triggers a thing called encoding specificity. When you're sad, it's very difficult for you to remember events in which you're happy. It's very easy for you to remember events in which you're sad. That's because your memory doesn't just store the facts, it stores all that perspectival participatory knowing. It also stores the state you're in. This leads to very sort of paradoxical things. If you lose your keys when you're drunk, one of the things you should do, if you want to get your keys back, is get drunk again, because chances are it will improve your memory. If you're studying for a test and you have a headache and you take some aspirin, when you're actually doing the test, take the aspirin, because it will improve your performance. I mean, so there's classic experiments on this. In one experiment, right, you have a bunch of people learning a set of words, right, in the same room, group A and group B, and then in the second part of the experiment, group A does it in the same room, group B does it in a different room. That's the only difference in them. Group A will remember a significant greater number of words than group B, just because they're in the same room. Okay? Now this is very adaptive. You may say, that's crazy. No, it's not, because your brain is trying to always fit you to the environment. So it doesn't just store information, it stores how you were fitted to the environment or the context. It's very adaptive. So now what's happening here? Well, you're in a bad state, so it's easy for you to remember bad things. That means it's easy for you to remember bad things, and that means you judge the probability of bad things happening to be increasing. This bad thing just happened to you, so it's very salient. That makes you judge that it's much more probable it's going to happen, and these are reinforcing each other. Now, all of this is interacting with what's called the confirmation bias. We'll go over a lot more of this later when we talk about problem solving. What this is an adaptive strategy you use where you tend to only look for information that supports your current belief. Because very often trying to find disconfirmation takes too long and it's very difficult and complex. So we tend to look for what confirms. So now, the confirmation bias, now as I'm going through my memory and my imagination, I will tend to look for things that confirm my forming judgment that this event is highly probable. Now all of this machinery can go awry, right? All of these heuristics will mislead you. It's because of this heuristic that people make mistakes when they take loved ones to the airport and things like that. right? Because we can imagine planes falling from the sky, and when it does, it's very representative for us. People describe it as a tragedy, it's in the news, and so we judged airplane crashes to be highly probable, even though they're very low in probability. But then we turn and get into our automobile, which is the North American death machine, without paying any attention to it. So we misjudge probabilities because of these heuristics. Now, we can't do without them. It's like when we talked about hyperbolic discounting. You can't do without them. They're adaptive. You need them. Let's continue this. So these are all reinforcing each other. The confirmation bias. So now what do? You judge the probability to be great. Okay. Now notice how most of this is happening automatically in a self-organizing fashion. That's again because imagine if I had to do everything fully consciously. Okay, I'm going to pick up the cup. Now I need to start tensing my upper bicep. I need to start moving my... If I had to move everything, I couldn't pick up the cup. I need my cognition to be inherently self-organizing. We've seen that throughout. The way in which your processes need to be happening simultaneously, bottom up and top down, like when you're doing reading and you're reading both the letters and the words. Your cognition needs to be self-organizing. It needs to be largely automatic. These are adaptively indispensable for you. Okay, so you judge the probability as great. Well, what effect does that judgment have on you? It's not emotionally neutral. Okay, that makes you anxious. When your brain starts to conclude that the probability of negative events is high, you get anxiety. What does anxiety do to you? Well, you lose cognitive flexibility. Your framing on things becomes very narrow, very rigid, very limited. What does that do? Well, that reduces your ability to solve problems. The ability to solve problems goes down. Okay, what does that do for you? Okay, as that goes down, you start to make lots of mistakes. And fail. What does that do? Well, of course, that increases your anxiety, and that reinforces, right, that bad events are happening to you. What does all that do? Well, all of this starts to gather in your mind as, I'm doomed. You get fatalistic. Well, if you're living in a fatalistic world, you're going to start interpreting more and more events, even neutral events, as bad. And the whole thing starts to feed on itself. The very things that make you so intelligently adaptive, the fact that your cognition zeroes in on relevant information, makes it salient, the fact that it's so capable of complexifying itself and organizing itself, the fact that it is trying to fit you to the environment and process information in a way that's doable within the real world. All these things that make you so adaptive simultaneously make you vulnerable to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. That's what it means to say all of your life is threatened. Realize that all of your life is threatened by dukkha. It's not that everything you're doing is painful or distressing. That is ridiculous. That is a meaningless claim. It's that every process you're engaging, every time you're exercising your intelligent agency, you're making yourself vulnerable to self-deceptive, self-destructive processing. We called this in the thing we published parasitic processing. It's not just about bad events. This is just one example. We get into all kinds of these spirals. We'll put up on the video a recent schema for what depression looks like that was released by some MIT researchers. Very complex like this. We call this parasitic processing because it's like a parasite in that it takes up life within you and it right, takes life away from you. It causes you to lose your agency. It causes you to suffer. And here's what's important. This capacity for your cognitive brain to be self-organizing, heuristic using, right? Complexifying to create complex systems and functions with emergent abilities, has a downside to it. Look, this is what you know when you're in one of these spirals. You'll know it. Oh no, here I go. Oh no. Knowing it, what does it do for you? What does your belief do? It's like knowing that I should go outside the square. Think outside the box. Doesn't do anything. Why? This is a complex, self-organizing, adaptive system. If you try and intervene here, the rest of the system reorganizes itself around your attempted intervention. It can adapt and preserve itself as you try to destroy it. Why? Because it's making use of the very machinery by which you adapt and make use of the things that are trying to destroy you. That's how it works. No matter where I am, this is a perennial threat. No matter what I am doing, this is always liable to happen. Now what's interesting, as I said, my colleague and good friend Mark Lewis, we're talking about comparing this to other work that he's recently been doing. So some of you may know Mark Lewis. I highly recommend you take a look at his work. Mark has been deeply influential in my own thinking, ideas about dynamical processing, self-organizing systems development. He is one of the foremost important neuroscientists about addiction and how addiction works in the world. I strongly recommend reading his book, Memoirs of an Addicted Brain. So Mark was himself, I'm not disclosing anything confidential because it's right in the book, Mark was himself an addict in his youth, and then he overcame his addiction, then he went into neuroscience to try and figure out what is addiction, how does it work. Now, that's important because addiction is primarily the loss of agency. Right? It's not, addiction is distressing and painful, but when we're talking about somebody being addicted, the way we finally diagnose them is by how dysfunctional they become, how much they lose their agency. Right? So you are a video game addict if you are playing video games to the point where you cannot pursue the goals you want to pursue in your life. You cannot establish and cultivate the relations you want to establish in your life. You cannot cultivate the kind of character or identity you aspire to. If the video gaming is robbing you of those agentic processes, then of course that is what we mean by addiction. Addiction is a loss of agency. Now, when you take a look at Mark's work, Mark Lewis, he challenges, right? I just saw him give a talk. I've been having lunch with him, but I also saw him have just a really good talk at the Society for Psychology and Philosophy, or Philosophy and Psychology. We'll get the order right. Just this past year. And he was not the only person making this point, but he articulated it with his own particular explanation, which is his. So the point that many of people are making is the standard model of addiction is incorrect, fundamentally wrong. What's the standard model? The standard model is we have a biophysical chemical dependency, and when the chemical is removed, we get an overwhelming compulsion to have to seek out the chemical. And if we don't get the chemical, then we suffer, similar to as if we were starving from a lack of food. And so that's what addiction is. And the problem with this is it sounds very commonsensical and the media likes it. It has the one unfortunate feature of being almost completely false. Because first of all, you can get addicted to processes that have no biochemical basis, like gambling, for example. Secondly, if the overwhelming compulsion model was correct, you have a great deal of difficulty explaining some very, very pertinent facts. Most people spontaneously give up their addiction in their 30s. We, of course, get focused on the people who remain addicted, and therefore we come to believe that addiction is an overwhelming compulsion. But if you actually track people, many people spontaneously stop being addicted. Here's a great historical example. You have soldiers in Vietnam during the Vietnam War getting addicted to opioids in Vietnam. The opioid crisis! Not that it isn't a crisis, but we tend to think that certain chemicals are intrinsically addictive. So, they get addicted to heroin. When they return to the United States, the vast majority of them spontaneously stop using the drug. But why? Chemical, not in the body. What's going on? Isn't there a biochemical lack and therefore a huge compulsion? Well, think about it. Think about it in terms of existential learning. See, when they were in Vietnam, they had a particular identity. They're a soldier. And they're in a particular arena, war. They're in a particular existential mode. When they return to the United States, they become a citizen, right, in a peaceful country. The relationship between the agent and the arena is what is fundamentally being altered in addiction. So Mark proposes a model that he calls reciprocal narrowing. So here's your agent, and here's the arena. And what happens is the drug use is associated with a particular agent-arena relationship. And what happens is, and we talked about this before, remember this is always co-identification. We're always assuming an identity and assigning identity in a co-defining, interdependent manner. What happens is you start to lose a little bit of your cognitive flexibility, perhaps due to something like this. As you lose your cognitive flexibility, the number of options in the world starts to decline, right? As the number of options start to decline, you lose the variability for your agency. As you get a tighter, narrower, less flexible cognitive agency, the number of options in the world goes down. And what happens is these two things reciprocally narrow to where you have no options as to who you could be or how the world can be. And that's addiction. It is a learned, not propositionally learned, perspectively, participatory learning of a loss of agency. I pointed out to Mark that if this is the case, there must be an opposite. If there's a spiral down, there must be a spiral up. And in personal communication, just recently, he said, yes, totally. And you know what that spiraling up would be. What would be the agent-arena relationship in which the agency and the world are expanding? That's anagoge. That's the move towards enlightenment. What I want you to understand is dukkha is these two things because they're interpenetrating. This loss of agency, because this is your agency. As you're simultaneously doing parasitic processing within, you're doing reciprocal narrowing without. Those are totally reinforcing each other. That's dukkha. And no matter where you turn, this is always threatening. You can't get free of it. You can't run away from it. You can't deny it. Remember, the Buddha tried self-denial. This is like trying to hop over your shadow. You can't do it because it is endemic. All of this is endemic. This is the agent-arena relationship. You can't do away with this. This is indispensable to you being a person. This is self-organizing, relevance realizing, complexifying, processing. You can't get away from that because that is what makes you adaptive. So what do? That's what the Buddha meant when you realize that all of your life is threatened by dukkha. He didn't mean believe that all of life is suffering. So, what we need is, how do we address this? Well, once you realize it as a provocation, the point is, you should feel threatened. You should feel threatened, because if I can make you feel threatened by what I've just done here, how close and intimate this threat is to you, then you're starting to enact the process of moving towards enlightenment, rather than just asserting some propositions that are largely inert. So, what's the standard way of presenting the second truth? Suffering is caused by desire. And that gets you into all kinds of problems. Because then, don't I desire enlightenment, but then you should not desire to, and then you can just get into all these weird loops, and right? A better way of thinking about it is realize that dukkha can be understood. Realize that dukkha is caused by the way in which you can become attached, which doesn't mean, right, that you just really like something. It means this sense of a narrowing of yourself and the world so that agency and options are lost. The way the addict is attached to their drug, which is not a compulsive desire, although they will experience it that way, it is better understood as a parasitic processing that has led to a reciprocal narrowing so that no alternatives are available to you. The third, the traditional presentation is the cessation of suffering is attainable. But realize, a better way of putting that is realize that you can recover your agency. Because this narrowing down can also, you can use the same machinery to anagogically ascend out of the cave towards the sun of enlightenment. Realize that this machinery, this complex machinery, this dynamical system can be exapted in a way that reduces your capacity for self-deception. Why? How? How do I address this? By a psychotechnology. The Buddha offered a psychotechnology of practices. Do you know how you deal with a complex dynamical system that is operating against you? By cultivating a counteractive dynamical system that is operating for you. You cultivate a dynamical system that doesn't intervene just here or here, one at a time, like your efforts. I'll try this, oh that doesn't work, I'll try this. Because every time I intervene, it just reconfigures, and I'm doing the same damn thing again. Here I am in this fourth relationship, doing the same damn thing again, and I know I'm doing it, and yet when I try and not do it, I find myself doing it. That will not work. That's why people end up in therapy. But what if I could create a dynamical system that could intervene here, 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 simultaneously and in a coordinated fashion? What if I created a counteractive dynamical system? And that it didn't operate just at the level of my beliefs, but operated at the level of my states of consciousness and my traits of character. That's what the Buddha offered. He offered the eightfold path. The eightfold path is a counteractive dynamical system that counteracts parasitic processing and does reciprocal opening beyond the ego self and beyond the everyday world. That's why it's represented by an 8-spoked wheel. It's supposed to be a self-organizing system that rolls itself, in which each part is interdependent on all the other parts. You might have heard it. The Eightfold Path is to cultivate right understanding, right thinking. There's various translations of this, right? Sometimes right aspiration, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and then right mindfulness and right concentration. We already talked about this. Saying there's right mindfulness and right concentration means there's incorrect. One thing, this right is not moral righteousness. This is right like right-handedness. It means getting an optimal grip. Because that's what my right hand is an expert in doing. It means getting an optimal grip. Notice this is about your cognition. This, right, is about your character. And this is about your consciousness. And it deals with ethical aspects, existential aspects, sapiential aspects. It is the attempt to give you a counteractive dynamical system that can deal with parasitic processing and that can help you reverse the reciprocal narrowing until you get anagogic awakening that takes you beyond the prison of the ego and the everyday world. So we see what's happening here. What I'm trying to show you is this higher state of consciousness, this awakening, is set into a context of helping you do important transformations. It helps you to remember the being mode to get out of modal confusion. It helps you counteract parasitical processing and reciprocal narrowing. It helps thereby to open you up to self-transcendence in a reliable and powerful way. This is what the Buddha was offering people. And I've tried to explain it to you in a way such that both you should feel threatened by what he is trying to provoke in you, and you should be encouraged. Both of these are enactment statements. You should be able to enact the threat and enact the courage, encouragement, enacting the courage, that you can respond to the parasitic processing and the reciprocal narrowing in your own life, to the modal confusion in your own life. Part of what we need to understand is how we can properly integrate this into what we have been learning about wisdom and meaning in the Mediterranean cultural historical context, and how all of that can be integrated within a current scientific worldview. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Whoa, what an episode. That was great. Looking forward to the discussion on this one. We're going to start that in 9 minutes, 20 seconds. I would like all of you guys to join the discussion link right now. You can do that by going to futurethinkers.org/discuss. We won't start for 10 minutes, but if you can just pile in there now, that would be great. And then I can let you in when the thing starts. So yeah, we'll take 10 minutes and I'll see you in a bit. All right, we're starting in 3 minutes. Okay, we are live. We're live. I think we're live. We're good. Everyone hear us?
Yes, indeed.
Cool. Okay, we're live. That's my favorite episode.
And mine too.
Yes,
Wow.
really good one. It really wrapped up a lot of threads from the previous 12 lectures.
Yeah. And the comment section was super active today.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to dive into that chart maybe sometime in the future. If anyone has audio playing through your speakers, it might be a good idea to mute.
Mute the YouTube video.
Yeah, mute, because that's feeding back. And then if you can wear headphones too, that would be good. I think you have audio coming from there as well.
Oh,
I think Juvi's microphone might not be working.
Oh.
Oh, no.
Probably.
There we
It's
go.
not.
Now it should be working.
Whoops.
Yep.
This control system is the bane of my existence. I constantly forget to unmute myself.
The same machinery that you use for broadcasting is the one
Can
that
be
you
used against you.
Yeah.
And will.
Okay, do you want to start with anything?
Yeah, I really like this idea of parasitic, what was it?
The
Processing.
title.
Parasitic processing.
Yeah.
And where he basically just dives into how the same machinery that can be used for insight can also be used to create self-deception and addiction. And
Yeah.
how breaking frame can get us out of that loop. And it was interesting that he said that the standard model of addiction is wrong. And one of the clues for this is that people often spontaneously break out of their addictions at certain stages of life or when they change their environment.
A big part for me in this was what I was furiously chatting about in the comment section, which is that the upward spiral and the kind of machinery of that upward spiral of the agent and Arita both needing to have that feedback mechanism to move up. And it also relates, because we've been talking about this a lot lately in the course calls as well. Oh, baby's waking up. What was that? Is he all right?
My chair.
Oh, we were talking about this course in the course calls, how I think it's from Cloud 9, that book about mapping Cloud 9, about how people who focus on oh man, why am I drawing blanks on personal development? Oh, peak performance, that's it. End up having a lot of benefit to their spiritual practices, and vice versa. People who have spiritual practice also have peak performance benefits as well. And I can see that in this when I've read books like Work the System, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Like, those books focus on creating the kind of internal machinery and the external machinery of having an upward spiral, both in like systemizing the environment. Like, a big part of that for us was travel and suddenly getting more time because we were taking advantage of the economic difference in living in Thailand, and then getting like more time to focus on that stuff. And then it was just totally an upward spiral from there, just getting control of the environment.
Yeah, I think that it's really important to remember that it's not about willpower.
Yeah.
If you start squawking too much, I'll grab him.
Sure. What did you guys think? Anyone? We have no procedure to this.
So I think that's the part of this I'm like most interested in too, is like trying to figure out how to design and implement like that positive spiral like in your own life. I was kind of talking about that a little bit last time too, and I was like kind of in the back of the head the whole time I was in the previous discussion. I was kind of waiting for this episode because I knew it was like the next one coming. But I don't know if John ever explicitly mentions this like in the series, but basically like in a lot of his interviews he's had with other people, and I'm like Ralph Kelly, like if you've seen those interviews, or I think it's from like Evolve Play and some other thing, Evolve Play Move maybe. Basically a lot of what they end up talking about in that interview is kind of figuring out how to design like an ecology of practices that would hit all of the 4 ways of knowing that he lays out elsewhere in the series as well. Like there's, like the propositional, procedural, perspectival, participatory ways of knowing, and then trying to figure out how to map 1 or 2 practices that you can put in opposition. So you have, one pulls you in, and he kind of talks about this in terms of like, one example would be say meditation, contemplation, for like the propositional side of things. So you have because basically what contemplation is scaling up versus meditation is scaling down. And so you kind of have these two in opponent processing with each other, so that not one of them doesn't take or push you too far in one direction than the other. I think that's a really helpful way to think about these things and try and figure out how we would go about designing something like this in our own life. You kind of think about things from each level and then figure out like a practice for each one of these. That's something I've been trying to do, is like figure out how and what to do for each of these levels. And then you talked about like the peak performance, like getting into peak performance could help you maybe like in your spiritual pursuits as well. Like you say, the more often you're getting into these peak performance states or flow states, then the more that could help you get into like these sort of more of like a transformational attitude, or maybe like a higher state of consciousness or something like in a meditation practice. I think that kind of goes back to, that's like a flow practice that fits into like the procedural way of knowing. And he talked about like, it's very, I think this actually might've been in the interview that you guys did with them. We talked about the importance of, is either that one or another one. We talked about the importance of having like a physical a flow practice to pair with um, your meditation practice. That's so. Anyways, that's something I've been thinking a lot about, and I have it all diagrammed out, but I'm waiting for my phone to charge right now so I can pull it up and I could reference it maybe. But
Yeah, please do share that when you get a chance.
sure.
Having a
But
baby
yeah,
crisis
I'd like to hear
right now.
if you guys have, I don't know, because that's something I've been thinking about the whole, since that interview, as I've been watching the series, that's kind of been in the back of my head, is like, how do we design this? How do we design this? What practices do we need? You know, like, and then the a big thing too is you were talking to as well, as the kind of like fitting our environment as well. It's like, you know, whether it's, you know, finding the correct community, or maybe you move somewhere where that's it's more possible to find that type of community, or sort of thing. Like I moved from Michigan to Denver, and now it's like all, you know, there's so many more communities that I could get involved with that would kind of make this possible. I'm still trying to find you know, find that community out here, but
It's really interesting how it's finding the right community, but also not getting stuck in too much of an echo chamber. So it's again like that, the same machinery that can help can also get us stuck in a loop. So it's a community that provides enough support, but where there's also enough kind of noise and randomness to shake things up, but not so much that it completely disintegrates.
yeah, it's really good.
Yeah,
So
I was thinking the same thing, that it's not only kind of different communities have a different focus and a different awareness, but also, you know, one of the things that the kind of paying attention to a deeper thread of this, one of the things that I'm concerned about are people who may try to engage in a process too early. Like there's something, you need to get to a certain level. If you, it can end in a sort of a bypass of suffering, rather than the proper cultivation of suffering, to the point where that upward spiral can begin. And it's an interesting sort of a higher order feedback loop of the ecology of practices and sort of the collective intelligence to self-assess. And this is new territory, right? In a lot of ways, even the existing practices that have happened over traditions and previously may not have some of the insights that will come about as we're doing this now. We're in a different place. So I think it's interesting to be really mindful as we move forward, not to get too fixed on finding the optimal community, the optimal practice, or even the optimal ecology, but really looking at the interaction between those and the feedback loops and the being aware of the tendency towards self-deception at the collective level is something that will be really important to recognize in the ecology of practices.
it's like the important thing is to just start. Like you can't worry too much about getting the best results, having the best this or this. It's like you have to, because that'll continue to move. It'll be like a moving target. As you explore these practices, you begin to realize that there's maybe better options. You know, that maybe the ecology that you've built was too heavy on one side and too light on the other, and you begin to remodel, or maybe the community that you joined wasn't the correct community, or doesn't provide enough outlets for you, or something like that. And you have to be able to move on. I liked what you said at the beginning there, David, that some people might get stuck if you like trying to pursue this. And there's a book, and I mentioned this guy last time too, from Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. He has there's a book called Spiritual Materialism. Well, there's Crazy Wisdom. Yeah, I talked about Crazy Wisdom last time just as an idea from him. And then there's Spiritual Materialism is another interesting term. And it's kind of like the idea that you could have, that you could, I guess I'll use his phrasing for it. So the idea that the ego could take possession of the spiritual path is kind of the way that he phrases it. And it's kind of the same, it's once again that, everything is threatened by the loss of agency or threatened by self-deception. It's like even the spiritual path itself that you're trying to use to pull yourself out of this, this narrow position that you're finding yourself in can probably become a way of narrowing itself. So it could close you down to other options or blind you to some other aspect or some other part of the ecology that you need to integrate or like find a home for.
Yeah, definitely. It's like the spiritual bypassing can happen, where
Yeah.
people start justifying their pathological behavior with, them having some sort of rank or having achieved some level of realization, where they suddenly think they're immune to, the consequences of their actions.
Exactly, yeah. And even that teacher himself, like Shogin Rinpoche, is like guilty of that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
As well as a bunch of people that within like Shambhala or these other large like Buddhist organizations. There's all sorts of like scandals with, like sexual accusations and misconduct or leveraging their position within the community or something, and that reframing it as I'm more enlightened than you and I know better than you or something like that.
Yeah. The gatekeeping's a big part of that too. I've noticed with people who are really trying to manipulate. They say, I am the holder of the secret knowledge and only through me can you achieve enlightenment. That's just disgusting. And you see that all over the place. Actually, I'm doing a video essay right now, which is kind of the episode 2 in this series I'm working on, where in this one I'm talking about sovereignty, which is I think that was defined in the chat, really related to this video. And in it, I'm using Emperor Palpatine and Anakin Skywalker from Star Wars and showing that whole manipulation process that happens when they're sitting in that theater and, all the things that Palpatine does. And that's a big one, the gatekeeping thing. Only through me will you realize the true strength of the dark side,
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think that I like Jamie Wheel's Rebel Wisdom interview where he talks about how to spot a cult and some of the things to be aware of with that. And it's interesting to watch activity and the discussion around Game B kind of blow up around this as well a little bit. It's interesting. See, there's a couple of thoughts that I have, and I don't know if they're related. One of them is around that is noticing that gatekeeping tendency, and even there's an accusation that is this just mental masturbation? Are we not really doing anything? And something in this, it's like, and I went back and found an older post by Ali from Rebel Wisdom as well, where he was like asking, hey, are we actually doing anything here? Or is this just a bunch of intellectual exploration? And there's something of the relational exploration, right? The relational practice of engaging in this that is necessary in order to get deeper into the practice, which I think is undervalued or at least not recognized as fully. And so the kind of squabbles and how we deal with each other and with ourselves in those squabbles is an important indicator of a practice that's necessary in order to really build a Sangha that's going to have the fortitude that doesn't just conform to a guru's lessons, but really the collective intelligence of the Sangha itself. Yeah. It's a real interesting and challenging problem.
Well, it's like to make sure it's not masturbation, it's like you have to have feedback. Like you have to have feedback from your environment to make sure that anything at all is actually happening, right? And I think another thing John said, like the best compliment, like you sound like compliment he got, was like, years after, I think like maybe 5 years or something after beginning his like spiritual, doing this morning routine that he's been doing for 28 years or whatever. He had someone say to him that he'd become wiser, or that he wasn't who he used to be or something like it. It was it was tangible to them in their relationship. And like I've had that as well in my life since like beginning, starting to do some of this stuff. Like, I don't know, 3 years ago, I started getting the meditation thing. I'm not like consistent, I'm not the most consistent meditator. I'm still getting better at that, but people do notice. And that's how I guess that's how you know that it's working. Cause I still don't see myself as different. I still, a lot of times you just see yourself as having the same problems or fighting the same mental battles or struggles. But, things will be changing or are changing when it's properly functioning, I think. As for the masturbation thing, that could just become mental. I mean, it's a really funny way to say it, but like that's something, and I don't know, like I don't have any sort of scientific backing for this, but like the meditation tradition that I dropped into through Dharma Ocean, where I learned a lot of these like practices and stuff, they're very like body oriented. So a lot of the practices that they have set up, it's like you're kind of dropping into your body and releasing tension, and you're releasing tension into the earth, rooting yourself in the earth. There's a lot of like pulling yourself out of this, like you're extending your mind into the body, through the body into the ground, through your skin out into the world. Like you're going elsewhere. You're trying to push yourself outside of yourself, and it's like, and once you're sufficiently outside of yourself, a lot of the like transformative work can be done. And it's like you kind of have like a route to come back to that can keep you centered because you can have difficult things come up especially when you're doing like a contemplative practice or something. You have a lot of difficult material come up or something. But I think, and I'm trying to relate that back to, we were talking in the chat about, I had mentioned like the view from above, or like the shamanic flight. And I think kind of maybe what you're doing is using some of that cognitive machinery to pull yourself away, to separate yourself from like your current frame, like create some, it's imaginal distance between yourself as you are now, and kind of look at things a little bit differently, if that makes sense.
Yeah, breaking out of the loops.
Right. But it's just finding some like a creative way to break frame.
I would like to relate this to also something that helped me and that we touched upon now is creating an upward spiral, how to do that after a life crisis. And one way to do it, as I found, is simply to create better habits, and this goes along with the 8 paths. Mm-hmm. Because there's a book called Atomic Habits, for example, by James Clear. And he states that if you only, instead of having these fantastic goals of being, for example, enlightened, or falling in love with the absolute right person, or getting this amazing career, it's like just pay attention to becoming 1% better. And you can do that with all the 8 paths. It's like you can be 1% better the next day at thinking, or the right livelihood, or the right speech, or the right action. And that has really helped me to build a routine of meditating each morning, having the semi-nasty green nourishment drink, stretching, and so on. So because sometimes it's hard to relate all this to, let's do some shamanic flight and get some perspectives. Sometimes the opposite is also correct, that if you only get 1% better at each of these 8 spikes in the wheel, then you're off to something good.
Mm-hmm. I think the thing we were talking about with the mental masturbation thing, and like how do we know we're actually doing something, I hesitate to ever want to prescribe a certain practice, and I think that's why John is focused so much on the ecology of practice and not like really ramming any one thing down people's throats, because it's like different practices mean different things to different people. It's like not everyone's going to get the same kind of dramatic change from an ayahuasca session or from meditation and yeah. And I think that's a big part of this collective intelligence building thing we're trying to do, like where you actually are discussing things and getting feedback, and there's this kind of emergent collective intelligence because you're able to get stories and feedback from other people who may or may not have similar experiences to you, and then you can see what they've done to improve their lives. But if you find that someone's like completely not like you at all, not suffering from the same problems, then their advice to, you know, do whatever, do ayahuasca or something, you may not apply that in your life. So I think that's something that is being undervalued, is just the general discussion between groups of people like this that doesn't have a set of to-do lists and homework at the end of it, like a set of conclusions that we all write down, and then, okay, that's the thing I incorporate in my life forever.
And you
And
can like
also-
relate that to following. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Also, sometimes practices can be accepted for, you know, self-development or for spiritual purposes. Like, you know, dance can be a spiritual practice where you become really, really in touch with your body and with the flow of energy through your body. And it's the same with what Mike was saying before. Like extreme sports can be a spiritual practice for people. So it's, yeah, I think it's kind of more about finding what works for each individual person and then sharing what you learned with others.
Yeah, and then there, it goes back to the Palpatine and the Game B discussion, like where people are gatekeeping the results of certain practices, right? It's like not everything is of value equivalently, and especially when you have different people in different past experiences, and for people to get all elitist about certain practices or results, it's like, yeah, counterproductive. Like I've had people kind of go like, yeah, I've taken a lot of lessons from playing video games, and sure, I waste a lot of time playing video games, but I see this kind of metacognition happening when I play big like battle royale, 60 people in a game kind of thing. And I think about that so much. And these little things that you could just roll your eyes at and be like, that's a waste of time. There's so much, depending on how you're applying your own consciousness to the situation, that can be gained from it. It's just like, yeah, this elitism in personal development and spirituality has got to go.
I think there's an important meta skill that exists, which is being able to discern and to recognize good teachers.
Which is so hard, because then say you have a really difficult problem you're working through, and it's all based off of this dukkha or the illusion of suffering, like this illusion you create for yourself. And then a teacher can see that and knows how you're deluding yourself, and their advice may seem completely counter to what you are thinking you need to do. So it's like, asking that we be more discerning about teachers. Yeah, sure, you can look for signs of like cults, and I think that's actually a good set of tools to use. But more often than not, when you really need something from a teacher, you really are stuck on something, the advice that you get is going to fly in the face of everything you've thought you should be doing.
There's like something that Paul Vanderklay said is like, you can't ever get past authority. Like when you're talking about these sort of things, it's like, because it's like, how do you know that the practice is going to give you results?
Yeah.
It's like you have to meet someone who's already gone through some aspects of the practice, or has to teach you the practice, or has to make it known to you so that you can even like get going, or know that it's worthwhile to get going, right?
We've talked in this group before about checks and balances and transparency in sanghas, and how the next Buddha should be or will be a sangha. I love that idea, and it's like that necessary kind of negator to the cult leader, to just have a group of people who also are doing the same practices and kind of point out that cultish behavior. I don't know, something about maybe, like, and I can't tell if this is like my Western mindset, but something about the single guru, the single teacher being like the gateway to your spiritual awakening is just, I don't know, the dark side. A pathway to the dark side.
Say, it's moving. I've said this before, but moving away from the single teacher to a multiplicity of teachers, and to finding the balance between your own internal authority and the realization that your internal authority can also go awry. So you need to balance that with outside authority, and finding the balance between you and other people And if you have multiple teachers that are not in conversation with each other directly, then you can take their agreement as convergence, like on that map John Vervaeke talked about last time, where the inputs are converging, right? And then we
Invariance.
kind of, we can kind of say, well, there's a high probability that this is right. Whereas if my teachers are kind of in wildly different areas, then I might want to re-examine what one of them is saying, because there should be multiple inputs and then some kind of convergence from whatever our sources of authority outside of us are, and inside of us too.
Yeah, and the sources of authority can be not necessarily people. They can also be books or, wisdom from people who are dead. For example, if you're reading Stoicism and then you're doing some shamanic practices and then you're doing some Buddhist meditation and you're finding commonality between all of those, then there's a good chance that you've got a nugget of gold.
It's not one teacher, not one practice. It's like you end up having you just end up by having a multiplicity of teachers, you end up having a multiplicity of practices. You begin to build that ecology.
Yeah, there's something that starts to look like opponent processing in the collective as well, right? And it's also noticing there's an interesting observation that I had this past week of the roots of the words authority, authenticity, and author are all the same, right? And there are interesting distinctions there, recognizing that sense of. There's also a noticing that what we typically mean by authority tends to be more gravitating towards the propositional knowing, and that as we get deeper into these practices and start to really recognize the shift in participatory knowing, that's the deepest layer, and that's the most devastating layer as well. It's really difficult to know at that level which authority to listen to, right? The ability to be able to distinguish almost goes out the window, and you almost have to wait for some integration or settling of all of that to happen.
So it's interesting. It's interesting way into the authenticity.
Yeah, and even deeper than that, even deeper than authenticity, as I'd say that something like, in my own view, this is rough, so it's very speculative, but the sense of authenticity is something like a perspectival truth. It's something down at that layer that which allows me to know from the various voices what is authentically the synthesis of who I am. But below that, at the participatory level, there's something like it's almost hard to discern. Like I have struggled a bit with trying to understand what is truly participatory knowing. When I've used the example enough of going through the 4 ways of knowing that I noticed I stumbled over participatory, and I started to notice, actually, I think it's more along the lines of like the faith that I don't even know is faith. It's so fundamental. It's almost like rock bottom what I consider real in the world. That's the participatory knowing. It's subconscious, below my level of awareness or language or anything.
The thing that's making everything else possible.
Right. And the only time it really becomes evident as a layer is when I'm going through a shamanic process where it's actually softened or disintegrates to some extent. I find that there's another layer below that actually widens my scope overall. And those are the times when I think that we can get to the spiral upward.
The nothingness or the emptiness that John starts getting into in the last 3 episodes of the series. I think that's where you get to a lot of this stuff, and it's like it's so hard to talk about, man. Or like to think about. It's like, or you try and talk about it with other people. Most people just like don't know. I don't know. A lot of people won't know what you're talking about, or won't have the words for it, I guess. Maybe they know what you're talking about, but they don't have the words for it to talk about it.
David, are you pointing to the unconscious mind at all with this?
Yeah, I am to some extent. I mean, it's. I think that it's unconscious, subconscious. It's really, I'll give an example of this. Is that a lot of the stuff that comes up around climate crisis and the possible collapse of civilization arises in as a propositional fear. There's a lot of stuff that happens, and we look at all of this stuff, but I think if we really listen deeply, one of the things I say is there's something like the deep genome. There's something in our below the level of our assumption about our place in the world that if we can allow the assumptions to really, the deep assumptions that we have about what's right and our place in the world to dissolve away, we'll find something underneath that, which will show not only a collaborative working with the other members of our culture, but with nature and and the universe itself. There's something in that that is unconscious. It is the deep unknown, the parts of myself that I don't even know that I know, right?
Yeah. Is my microphone on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to add to that I totally agree with that. There's something that is very deeply alive at that level, and very connected to everything else that is alive. And there's kind of a inherent rightness to it in a way. And it's difficult to talk about it, yeah. But I totally agree with you that this climate kind of fear of climate change and all this stuff happens at a layer more conscious than this deeper layer. And I think a lot of people experience this when they do something like ayahuasca. They access this deeper layer, and they describe it as this kind of grandmother or mother spirit, because it's very very alive, and there's something about it that feels safe and connected to everything. It isn't dying in the same way that, you know, the news are showing nature is dying.
It's like, it's interesting. You'd have like the imaginal representation of like the mother. It's like something that's like comforting, or that holds you. Because it always is in like an ayahuasca ceremony. Always, I haven't taken ayahuasca. I've just read a lot of trip reports on like Earwood and stuff like that, and it always comes back to that. It's like, it's invariant in some sense that people would connect with that sort of figure.
Yeah, I'm curious what other threads there were from the lecture that people were aware of or want to bring up.
Especially the people who haven't spoken yet. Love to hear from you.
While waiting for others, I just want to add one thing, because, connected to what I spoke about habits before. Just to avoid parasitic processing and increase your options of agency and knowing which teachers to listen to and everything. Based on my own experience, I highly recommend that you listen to different teachers and you implement those as habits in your life, and you test them out and see if you get better. It could be 1% a week or whatever. I use an app, and this is very concrete. Again, it's not philosophical, but it's called Habit Bull. It's free to use. So you can track your habits and you can change them in any way you want. So you can listen to any teacher you want and see if it brings you forward or backwards within a week. So it's a concrete tip again. And now I will be quiet.
What is the name of it?
Habit Bull.
Bull.
Is the app. Yeah.
Check it out.
Very simple and straightforward. It reminds you to set up. You set up your own habits, and it reminds you.
Nice.
Certain times. Yeah.
Yeah, so Patrick, I'm glad you brought it back to that. I was trying to get my mic working, so now we're working. I was thinking a lot about the use of various teachers, not just relying on one guru, like Mike was saying, like trusting the one gatekeeper to allow you to your spiritual,
salvation.
Maybe salvation. Yeah, exactly. Like, and also something Yuvi said, like allowing nature to teach you. Like that's something I've been really trying to focus on, is allowing not just human teachers, but also teachers beyond the human realm, which can be definitely like challenging because we understand humans, like we can get humans, but I think that everything can be a teacher. And that's just, for me, at least a big part of my like exploration of self and like spirituality.
Miyamoto Musashi. It's the universe is my teacher.
That's such a good point. I mean, just in watching other mammals, you can learn so much, or even non-mammals, you can learn a lot from
Mycelium.
Yeah. Okay, that's going far. I can't picture that, but I mean, I've sat and stared at our bearded dragon in our old apartment, or I've sat and stared at my dog and just watched how he's processed different types of pain and doesn't make a big thing out of like a broken leg or, you know, a gash or something or a toothache. Like you just, yeah, this is life. It's pain. It's a sensation in the body. There's no additional thinking necessary.
Yeah, a book that I'd highly recommend along these lines is H is for Hawk. It's a really beautiful illustration of someone who is a falconer, raising a goshawk that is just exquisite in terms of noticing the way in which observing another being's intelligence changes what is seen. I mean, it's a very powerful illustration of that. A very intimate relationship as well. It's exquisite. There's a lot of intelligence there that I think we miss. It gave me a deeper appreciation for nature.
It makes me think of breaking frame again, right? Like what a powerful way to break frame. It's a consciousness that is completely, I mean, not completely different, but so vastly different from our own, and yet is no less conscious. I was thinking earlier this week about actually the Donald Hoffman book came up, but I was thinking about if an alien landed here, what they would perceive, right? Would they even see my form? Like what to think of, like what does a hawk see, right? It's so different. And I feel like I want to draw that back to the idea of like finding a teacher or finding a spiritual community. And I think one of the most powerful things in this age of filter bubbles is being part of two different worlds, or more than one world at the same time, which happened to me when I kind of dropped into the Future Thinkers calls this summer and got involved with all this stuff and more into the Game B stuff. Suddenly I was in a different world from the world I'm normally in, which is art related. And suddenly being in two gives you a whole new perspective, because then the first world isn't the world. You suddenly realize it's one world in an infinite number of worlds. And so, and I think it comes back again to this having versus being mode, right? It's the being mode is somewhere in the building the capacity for this kind of travel between worlds, rather than focusing on the object of the world itself.
I always use a metaphor like bridge building. Like you have to build the bridge between, in this case we're talking about worlds, so you have to build, and it's if you live in this world and you come to this world, you have to build something that connects the two.
Oh, this also reminds me, I was just listening to the talk that Mike and Yuvi had with Nora Bateson about the climate related, and she talked about the multi-contextualness of everything, and I think that strongly ties in here, like the worlds that you're existing in, you as a thing, as a complex system, are existing within multiple worlds, and sometimes you yourself are the bridge. Like you are the thing that ties you to these different worlds, and you have to learn to interact, I guess, like appropriately in all of the worlds. I don't know if that, you know.
That's a really, yeah.
That's what came to mind with me, though.
Really good point, because, yeah, I remember now, she talked about how your relationship with all the different things matters, how you're not just impartial, because you are the bridge. So I'm really heavily paraphrasing, but what I got out of it is that how you connect and interact with all these different elements of your life really matters.
Yeah, that's definitely part of what I got from it too, is that like you can choose how you act within your roles in all of the different contexts that you exist within. And that's definitely, I think, ties into the upward spiral of like, how do you make an upward spiral that impacts all of your contexts that you exist within?
You know, we talked about this one or two calls ago, and this reminds me of this idea I'm really against, which is people having more controls over the filtering mechanisms of their realities, especially people who don't recognize the benefit of resilience practices and exposure to the world. People who would opt for comfort in all areas of their lives and would create circumstances where they only get filter bubbles of their own opinions echoed back to them. And this is something I can't tell what the difference has been for me. If it's been travel, if it's been, early interaction with a lot of different types of archetypal North American people. But it's like, I've found it as I've gotten older a lot easier over time to recognize people I know or people I care about in any person I ever meet. Like if I'm in some village in Vietnam, I can see my mom in some old lady there. Or if I'm like watching videos on YouTube of a Trump rally, I can see like friends of friends, or, I can see these people and see where maybe I can see their wants and desires right in front of them, or right in front of me there, and recognize people in them. And I think that's such an important thing to be able to make that bridge, is recognize like, it's not like just me and you or us and them. It's, this is so cliche to say, but it's we're all the same. We all have some little connection, and it's just a little bit of effort on your part, my part, to be able to like see that similarity in someone else.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder how much like the sort of reductionist specialization into all of these roles that we have in the West has contributed to the disintegration of that feeling of commonality, right, between people, because people are just pigeonholed in these tiny little niches, surrounded by other people in that niche, and we're so disincentivized to cross over and be part of two worlds.
I think resilience plays such a huge role in this. And Jonathan Haidt's book, Coddling of the American Mind, really touches on a lot of these. I think he has 4 pillars. I can't quite remember all of them, but it was people are fragile was one of the main ones anyway. Anyway, you guys should Google it. It's a good book. It really answers this thing, like this sort of belief in Western civilization that we are fragile and we should limit exposure, which then crosses so many boundaries into like limiting social exposure and limiting, Yeah,
and I was just watching something the other day, I think it was like a PBS special talking about the brain, and it's like they find that often people feel that fragility, especially in old age, or any type of circumstance you feel fragility. The reaction is to lean away from that, to like, oh, I'm having troubles with that, I should stop doing that so I don't hurt myself or don't further damage myself. But in reality, you need to lean into that and learn to adapt to it, as opposed to running away from it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot over the past couple of weeks, particularly with suffering. It's interesting that it's leading up to this with this thing. But I'm working on a Medium article called "The Undertow of Suffering," which is kind of that notion of suffering is not something to cure or cope with, but really to lean into or fall into, which is a very interesting and distinct notion. And it feels like this is something that it also is interesting to think about Heather, what you're saying about the reductionist individuation that happens. It's almost, when I hear that, it's the idea that pops up in my head is there's almost something like a proof by contradiction that we're separate. That's almost like, if I can prove that I'm separate, how far down that path can I go before I find that that's a bankrupt strategy, that I have to rely on my connectedness again, and it collapses in a very profound way, and I love that notion, and especially thinking, I just started reading Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, and recognizing hemispheric specialization. And it's a very, if anybody hasn't read it, it's much more nuanced than conventional science would have you believe, or popular science would have you believe. It's misunderstood to a great degree, but something, and this is possibly another oversimplification, but something that occurred to me is the having mode and being mode seem to be somewhat brain specialization, having mode being more the left brain and being mode being more the right brain. And it makes sense in a way that the having mode being the one with language seems to be dominant in a dictatorial way, right? And the being mode without language has to find nuanced ways to express itself. But that's sort of that, in a way, the being mode holds the having mode, right? So the having mode can branch out, see how far it can stretch away from homeostasis before it collapses and is reheld by the being mode. So I love that notion, and that this is not a brokenness that we have, but it's actually built into the infrastructure of how development happens.
I just have a short comment on what you said, Heather, regarding specializations, and that we should all specialize in our special areas and everything. There's a very beautiful book written by Kenneth Mickelson and Richard Martin. It's called The Neo-Generalist. Where you go is who you are. And it all brings up this whole notion that we should not just focus on some narrow things and things that we can solve, think that we can solve any given big, huge problem with that. We should branch out. And so it's the Neo-Generalist, where you go is who you are. Excellent book. And I've met Kenneth Mickelson. He's a Danish philosopher, member of the Dukkha Forum and so on, and excellent thinker. So, and that's branching out. And that's what they think is the way for the future, to combine different skills and areas and experience in your life instead of just focusing on one thing.
It's also a really good way to gain different perspectives that you can switch between, which would prevent you from getting stuck in a loop or getting stuck in kind of a narrow-minded view of things.
I wanted to share something with you guys. I used to study audio, and I've taken, this is another example of like weird random things that provide spiritual insight, but I'm just going to share this. So this is an audio level meter, and you notice that like it's playing audio, and this peak bar is measured by the yellow here, the little yellow line. And it's like what society has, and that would be like your pain threshold or your ability to deal. And so by having the volume go up a little louder, it raises the pain threshold, but it always comes down eventually. It always returns to stability of wherever the audio is kind of hovering around. So it's like a lot of Western civilization has decided to just continually turn the volume down, which means the pain threshold just kind of follows with it all the way to nothing, where like anything is setting us off.
I'd like to offer a counter to that, or just a different kind of element that helps create a more complete picture.
Sure.
I think that there are a few other factors at play here, because we used to be a lot more socially connected. And so I think I talked about this somewhere recently, I can't remember where, but there are certain natural ways of processing stress that humans have that have been really downgraded in recent decades. One of them is social connection. When we're socially connected with other people, we're able to process our emotions so that they don't turn into trauma.
But this is
and
part
the second thing is physical activity, not just exercise like going to a gym for a set number of minutes per day or per week, but actually just continuous physical activity where we're walking around, picking things up, and our body is just continually active. And that also prevents stress from accumulating in the body. So it's not just that we have arbitrarily decided as a society to lower our threshold of pain or discomfort, is that our capacity has actually been lowered by these other circumstances. So it's both. It's agent and arena.
What
right?
I'm also doing here is making the argument that that change of that isolation is also perpetuating exactly this as well.
Exactly, yes.
Like you're right. It's not caused by some arbitrary turning down of the volume knob because we culturally decided to do that, although that is an element. But like, we would get more exposure out there in the world if we still had the same kind of social organizational structures. But part of the reason we don't have that is because now that we've got this different social organizational structure, it's become our comfort zone has shrunk, and now it's become more difficult to go and do that. You know what I mean? Because that pain threshold has been reduced, it's harder to turn it around now.
You're
Which
pointing
is
at kind of the
reciprocal narrowing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
The
funny
one thing
that. Go ahead, Heather.
I just quickly wanted to point out that just the one thing that is important is that it's not that volume line can get stuck, right? That's what happens with trauma. It can get stuck at a high volume, and then the distress decreases and you're stuck up here. And so it's not always wise to move into suffering unless you're resilient enough to handle it. So there are lines that need to be, no, lines isn't the word,
or you need a
there's-
practice to make you more resilient while you're opening yourself to higher levels
Yes.
of stress.
Yes, you need a
Another-
certain level of discernment to know what is an appropriate level of suffering to that's not going to destabilize my system into chaos, right? That I can adapt to and become more resilient. So there's a really important distinction between just full force move into suffering versus like, okay, no, there's a really careful line a lot of people have to walk.
Yeah.
And most of us don't really have those trauma processing mechanisms or practices installed to be able to process anything, which is partially why we're moving all the way down. But it's like, I don't know, there's something in me that tells me that some amount of exposure without the coping mechanisms actually creates some coping mechanisms. It's just a bit more precarious of whether you will naturally tend towards like an effective or healthy way of processing it or an unhealthy way. I guess again, it's with that reciprocal spiral.
This sort of brings up for me Vygotsky and the whole idea of like the idea of having a more knowledgeable other to model and scaffold. Like you can apply that to emotional trauma, you can apply that to physical trauma, you can apply it to spiritual teachers. The goal is to have someone who's able to see more than you can see and knows how to properly calibrate for you what you need to do, which means they need to have methods of determining where you're at so that they can then test and help you push yourself and in some ways optimize your perspective. Now, it's not necessarily over optimizing, but it is preventing you from it's canceling out some of the noise that you would spend stumbling around. Now, like you were just saying, there's benefit to stumbling around and learning how to discern what's noise and what's not by yourself, because then you sort of learn how to do it. But it's not necessarily the fastest way to get there. And there's benefits to taking the slow way, but I think, it's one of those things where you have to sort of balance where you're at. And like I've spent a lot of time stumbling around trying to teach myself all kinds of things. And I think the most important thing I've learned is that having a teacher can be really nice to just sort of move you forward. Because you can get stuck just doing the same thing over and over again and think you're improving and not really getting anywhere.
Like the spiritual path, like I don't think it can be an autodidactic path. It's like it requires that community. I think there's like there are elements. It's like, yes, you do need to do, I think at some point, if you're going to do like meditation, at some point you should be doing solo retreats and you should be dropping more, into that space of like nothingness or emptiness, as like David was talking about earlier, like dropping down like into, kind of the bios of yourself and figuring out how, seeing how things are coming up for you. But you need to have people that can figure out if you're ready. There's someone to help you determine if you're ready, or literature, or to help you determine if you're ready, or people that have swam in these waters. There's like there's you could spend your whole life, there's so much noise, you could spend your whole life on noise and then die and never get to the signal that you were looking for.
You need someone who can immediately couple you to reality and not your own illusions. Like, oh, you think you're ready? What about this? Thunk, you know?
Yeah, I'm curious. One of the things the thing that I get the most out of Vervaeke is the 4 ways of knowing is a new frame to kind of look at aspects of this. And I notice, in my own sense, I came up with a way of thinking about this of the opposable self. There's a way in which when I feel distressed by a situation or by a relationship, I can notice that the distress is experienced as a dissonance within my own body. Like I can find a place, it's almost as if the dissonance is between, and I think that this is accurate, when I'm looking further, a dissonance between 2 of the ways of knowing. Like my propositional knowing is threatening something at one of the other layers of knowing. And there's something, and an example I use of this is riding a bicycle, 2 people riding a bicycle at the same time. Propositionally, I know what I want to do, but my body, my procedural knowing disagrees with me. Or the other example is riding a bicycle with the wheel reversed. It's like, it's really complicated to resolve. They operate at such different speeds, right? The propositional operates at a very fast speed and the procedural operates at a slower speed, and it's like the layers operate at a different speed deeper down. And that difference in speed can result in a kind of a dissonance if they're not properly aligned. And so there's something beautiful about noticing that within myself. It gives me, and that it gives me a way of investigating, being compassionate with myself, at the same time being a little more strict with myself. Noticing, okay, wait a minute, am I self-deceiving here? Am I preferring one thing because of the dissonance in me? Or am I really leaning into that suffering in that dissonant way? And am I capable of doing that, right? But the thing that's also nice about this is I think that, and I'm curious about this kind of a frame as a way for people of different traditions and different ecologies of practice, different teachers, to be able to speak to that. There's something that seems like it might be a way in which it's easier to talk about the kinds of challenges that people are having. It so far has been, in my experience, whenever I hear people talk about it, it seems very individuated and metaphorical in a way that's hard to understand.
And I think it's like when you have conversations like this, what I've noticed, so you're kind of talking about how everyone almost has their own language for this, right? So it's, and because I have a buddy who's watched, him and I have both watched the entire series, right? And, like every week, every other week, so, a couple weeks, whatever, we'd call each other and have like a 3-hour debrief to like go through all the material, right? And something he always like talked about is that we live in different, I live in Colorado now, he lives back in Michigan. And something he'd always talk about was that it was how difficult it was to try to talk to people about this. Like, yeah, he's having such problems like trying to find ways to communicate this material with other people, because it's been so meaningful and important for him, but other people just don't have the terminology that he needs to be able to have this type of conversation with. And then I could relate to him, because like I still find ways to have this conversation with people. This is like somehow like I'm the guy at the bar who you talk to, and then somehow we end up talking about what I want to talk about, which is this stuff. But I think there's what you always have to do in that is that you have to figure out kind of where someone is, and you have to speak their language. So it's like I have a mapping, but then I'm going to map what I want to say onto a way, like I find a good metaphor, or like a metaphor they could relate to, or something they think would be funny, that's like apt, that fits. And you can like see lights go off for people. And it's not that I'm like smarter or something. It's just that we spent time thinking about a lot of this stuff, and I'm starting to have words for it. So you can find like a creative way to have that conversation with someone. But I think the more that this grows prominence, the more popular this becomes. I think that's the point of this series, that it gives you, and that's kind of what he does at the end, right? With the prophets of the meaning crisis, like here's here's 4 people who that came into this problem and created their own language and their own solutions in their lifetime for this problem. And you now have a toolkit, a way of understanding what they meant, a way of knowing what it is that they're saying, and mapping and reframing it using this language that he's now given us. And you can use that within, across spiritual traditions as well. It's not just with, prophets of the meaning crisis, with Buddhism or Christianity, or with, you can have like Jonathan Peugeot can talk to, any of the other people on like the intellectual dark web, and they can all have the same conversation, even though, or they can use similar terms now that they've had that the people have watched this series, rather than having to rely on, something from like a Christian mystic that is like, from hundreds of years ago that's maybe not as well known or well read or something like that. Because as we talked about before, or talked, early in this conversation, it's like this, as you get deeper down into these levels of knowing, it's harder and harder and harder to find words or to talk about any of this stuff. So it's the framework that we have right now is definitely useful.
I feel what he's doing is giving us a shared vocabulary.
Exactly.
There's also something about demystifying the whole thing, which I think is so needed. Mm-hmm. Because if I don't for me to go and talk to like a friend about spiritual development who's not into that, right? Is that the baggage of even that term has nothing to do with what I'm talking about, right? Like this is the John Vervaeke lecture. It's so a lecture series. It's so grounded in science and rationality, and yet also participatorily grounded within his own experience. And it's not all this woo stuff, right? Yeah. Or holy stuff, or whatever, all this baggage people put on these things. And I think that's a huge part of what's amazing about this lecture series, is that demystification starting to happen.
So we don't have to have, like Western materialists running around with like new age secular bullshit.
Yeah, he does seem to de-woo the sacred, right? That seems to be one of his primary goals, and I think he does an extraordinary job of it. I do want to actually, something interesting. So Tony, I noticed. I'm gonna say, I noticed that I find that the amount that you're talking is I'm pointing to it, and I don't want to shame or overly criticize, but there's something in the excitement of I found people I can talk to this stuff about, and I'm curious as the ability to translate and be able to convey information and knowledge, convey concepts that are hard to get, is very tempting. It's something that I noticed, and I think the part of me that feels anxious when you're doing that is my own part of I'm trying to hold myself back, and I don't think I do as good a job as I would like to. I do something similar, but there's something in this that is listening to the collective of what's here and what wants to be spoken in a larger context, and not just the most expedient conclusion, which is, it's really a interesting and difficult balance. And to throw something in at the very tail end of this, one of the criticisms of the Game B discussion on Facebook is there aren't very many people of color. And I'm noticing this call has very little diversity. It's mostly white males. And I'm curious about that. It's not a criticism as much as it's an interesting noticing. And there's something of the criticism that it's a kind of a colonial perspective. In some sense, that doesn't surprise me, because it is the kind of the collapse of the colonial perspective in the forefront of that. The people who are kind of most privileged, most aware from that perspective, may have some deep awareness of how it's crumbling. So we have almost a need, a compulsion to find others who are finding that edge, right? It's something.
Go ahead. Sorry, I thought that was.
No, I was just. No, it basically is. That's the tail end of it. It's just like it almost seems like it might be challenging to incorporate too many other perspectives as we're trying to find what is it that is no longer satisfactory about the status quo for us.
Yeah, and there's a very specific way in which Western culture is fraying right now or crumbling, that is more relevant to certain demographics than others. You know, like
in what
for
ways
example,
and to who?
for example, you know, the Joker movie exemplified that very well. It's the crisis of the single white male. It's that kind of nihilism and destructive narcissism, yet coupled with kind of a search for self-actualization and search for meaning. It's very particular to the single white male, you know, like the incels and that kind of demographic, and might be less relevant for other demographics.
What to do about it is always my question, and really it's kind of a rhetorical question, because I don't think anything can be done, and therefore the discussion about it is just kind of like self-reflective a lot of the time, but not really, there's no action that can be taken from it. It's like affirmative action to get a diverse crew in here would be artificial. You know what I mean? It's
There's
like
something
go ahead, Heather.
just because I actually thought about this morning, because I sometimes don't feel like joining this discussion, and often just because it's difficult for me, like this is challenging for me to be here and participate and be streamed on YouTube, but I feel compelled to come and represent one female voice, because I know there's often not other girls here, and I know Yuvi's more in the background now taking care of Alexander. So I was thinking about this morning, and I was thinking, like, even to just put in the chat a little word of encouragement to say, hey, if there's any women or people from other cultures that want to join the talk, and maybe that doesn't do anything, but I don't know that it's artificial. I think there's a sense of subconsciously when I see a group of one demographic, which is not mine, discussing everything, I feel a little bit hesitant to jump in, because it, for whatever reason, I guess I don't already see myself there, and so there's a barrier somehow. So I don't know. I think there are ways to maybe invite, hey girls, if you're out there, come join us.
That's so awesome that you say that, because it's like, it's not proposing that the group changes. Like, we are what we are, and the fact that we're all just white dudes doesn't mean we're doing something wrong. So I'm glad you're not saying it in that way. It's like you've talked about, I don't want to call it an instinct, but maybe an impulse to not join because you're not represented in the demographic of this group, and you ignore it and you come anyway, and your input is always so valuable to this group. So it's like, and when we have more women in this group, it is more interesting. It's more dynamic. There's something new to it that's interesting, but it's not, I mean, and that's where that question comes. Like, what do we do about that? Because it's more on the side of the participant, like yourself, that says, fuck it, I'm going to do it anyway. You know, that's where that real change comes, like, to just ignore it and go into it anyway. So thank you for doing that. I do agree with you. I wish more people would do that.
Yeah, and I think, Heather, the thing that you were saying about, like, it not being, I guess Mike mentioned, like, not making it an artificial, like, affirmative action type thing. I think your method of approaching that is totally natural. Like, you know, you saying, I want to be a part of this conversation, and just doing it, and then also advocating for others, like, hey, you guys should also join this. Like, I feel like that's the most, like, the invitational aspect of it, I think, is really important. Not like a, you know, oh, if you join, you get rewarded. Like, that's not the, like, we just still want this to be the free flow of it. But yeah,
or we got to remove some guys to make room, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, and I think, Heather, your approach, yeah, exactly, merit system, who speaks first and last, and no, but like, Yeah, no, Heather, I think the invitational aspect is what makes it natural, in like that you are a participant of this group, and you from that point say, others come join us. I very much admire that. I like that.
There is a bit of a barrier to entry, I would say, which might be part of the problem, which is that like all of us are really into this and watching this 50 episode lecture series, 50 hours worth of lecture material, and like people don't have a lot of time. And it's if people are going to have access to the conversation, we can invite them, but we're going to all, it's like what was mentioned earlier in terms of like the language and the jargon, we kind of have to like people have to sort of pick up on the language. And I guess some of that can happen implicitly, but to someone who's new and you invite them into the conversation and you start talking in all these strange terms, they don't have any motivation to try and learn the lingo, really. It's like we can invite them, but then there's all this other stuff and opponent processing and what does all this stuff mean? I mean, Vervaeke spent a whole 50 lectures just to like explain what he's talking about so people could have these conversations. So I think that's something to keep in mind.
And again, it's like, this is why I dislike conversations like this. That fall into this category of like inclusion and race and culture and gender and all of the stuff, because it's like the job of the group is just to be inviting as possible and just be true to what we're saying, be authentic, and the demographics will probably represent themselves as they do. I mean, someone else in the group said, Lynn said she's here, she's a girl, and I think there's a few other people, but probably the whole majority of the group, it's like 80%, 90% male. And maybe John's viewership reflects that as well. And maybe that's some sort of reason culturally, whatever. But it's like, it's not really our job to do anything about that. We are just trying to have the conversation. And I think our job needs to be just be inviting. Don't be intimidating. Don't be dicks, which I don't think anyone in this group is. So it's like, beyond that, there's not much that can be done.
You can't force these things.
Yeah.
Oh. And I can say, like, the people I know here in Sweden who listen to John Vervaeke, they are all girls, so I can try invite some of them.
Yeah, I
There's
just also
also-
wanted to
Except for
just
me,
really
then.
quickly
I'm
wanted
Swedish.
to say that I have always felt very included and comfortable with this group, and that that people don't participate for a huge variety of reasons. So I think you're right on target with just being inviting, and there's not
And
much
what's
else we
interesting
can do.
is your participation brought to light that idea that like some people might be afraid to participate. Like I was bugging Fuji Apple to come in at the beginning of the call because I don't even know if it's a man or woman, but they've been participating a lot in previous chats. And I see a lot of other people like that too. And it's like, I want to encourage them. But you brought up a few weeks ago, like, what did you say? People might be afraid to appear stupid or something in the call or something like that. And so I sent out an email to our mailing list about that. Like, hey, come in and join these calls. They're really fun because we do so many other ones too. And like that actually really had a positive effect on turnout. So
I think that's one of the benefits to appear stupid. For real. Because you open up, we have no idea how to solve all these different complex questions, but we at least participate and we listen and we learn from each other. So I'm glad you're stupid on these calls.
Yeah, me too. That's my goal. Be the dumbest person in the room. David, related to the Game B discussion, the person in question bringing up all of these problems is kind of known for am I muted? Is kind of known for race baiting a lot. And as you've noticed in that group, it's now just all about that. It's like constant firefight now about what to do about this person. And I think that's a very tactical move on their part to kind of like play to this white guilt impulse and then to, prey on that as a response. And so like, look how much the discussion has deteriorated since then. I don't know if the overall quality of it has, but I'm just noticing that little bit is like completely unproductive. But
yeah, I did.
Do you have something to say? Yuvi's signaling me, but she's not saying anything.
Okay. Well, I'd say that I noticed, that it is, I'm aware of it, and I'm interested in noticing it. Like I said at the very beginning of it, one of the things about it is actually the relational component of learning to have difficult conversations in groups. It, when it started out, and actually some of the conversations were innocent enough, and even myself, I was kind of poking and prodding and looking at some aspects of it, kind of the homogeneity of our perspective and the utopian vision. It's like, I'm not so sure I'm keen on the utopian, like, ideal futuristic vision of, something that may not be quite working. But the thing that really stood out to me is when it flared up, it so much represented the flame wars that I was used to when we first got internet and email way back when, and the inability almost not to stick my foot in my mouth. This is a loss of sovereignty, right? I get stupid. It's a kind of it's a kind of trap that we go into, where we just start slinging stuff, and it's like, oh, this is how I could see myself being tempted, and then knowing, no, there's nothing for me to say here. I can't say anything that's going to make it better. No criticism of myself or anyone else. So I think that's worthwhile, and I think that there is sort of a collective immune system that's learning how to deal with that. So I think it's better. It's better than it used to be. It's still not. It still needs some fine tuning.
It's pretty cool watching that immune system develop in there. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, it does seem. The other thing that I would say is, it's not when I've been in several groups where it was mostly white people, and talking about how do we invite people of culture, people of color into this conversation, and I think that's not the answer. But I think Nora Bateson spoke to it in her interview with you. She's starting to do more, just single-handedly going out in different communities, different cultures, and having that conversation one-on-one. There's a way in which that seems like it, if we're interested in opening the conversation, something like that might be worth trying out. Having conversations with people around us that may not think are part of this conversation.
You have the tools. If you watch the series, you have the tools to do that. Like, you can have this conversation with anybody, I feel like.
Yeah, I love that point that she brought up, that the people who are able to create change and are able to use these ideas and these tools to actually apply them are not the change makers, are not the people that we think. They're, the single moms in LA ghettos, and, the people who have mental illness, and just, the groups that are not at the forefront of the conversation.
Which really seems to me about being able to speak the language, to be able to, like, take the medicine and then speak the language of the people who need it by also needing the medicine and using it. There's one more point I wanted to add on to this about the race thing, David, and what was going on. There's a mistake, I believe, that happens on both sides of the race discussion, which is, like, if you belong to that majority demographic and you observe a discussion like that, you might feel unable to say anything, and you might self-censor over and above what you would normally do to just have a productive conversation. You might just be like, no, hands up, I'm not participating. And on the reverse of that, if you're a part of the minority group, you might do exactly what Heather had mentioned before, which is not to participate because you don't feel represented. And it's that instinct that I feel is a problem on both sides. That's all I wanted to say about that. It's just both sides, whether you believe it for better or worse, are not saying something because of an identity rather than an idea that they have. It's because I belong to this group, so I shouldn't say anything. That's wrong.
Yeah, I think there's value in, like, expressing your ideas as an individual, regardless of the group or the context that you come from. Like if you have an idea and you happen to be a white male, you should still express that idea, or regardless of what categories you fit into. I think that's super valuable, because like once you start to break down those, like, oh, I'm part of this group, so therefore I shouldn't say this, and just like say what you feel and what you think, and be, like you said, like genuine. That's when we start to break down those boundaries of like these deeply embedded racisms and sexisms and things like that.
You know what else is so funny and interesting? I love the synchronicities of these conversations. It happens all the time. Just this morning, Yuvi and I were discussing like the race conversation, because it also relates to because we were discussing the Game B stuff. And we realized, like, we did some math in our heads and realized that we've been minorities for about a third of our lives, just from all the travel. Anywhere we've gone to, we've been minorities. And obviously that's not a complaint or anything. It's just like it's just the reality of it. And it's been interesting to watch particularly how much of the race conversation is occurring in America and some Western countries who are culturally very similar to America, and not in other places, like most of the places that we travel to. There is a lot of, you might hear the term reverse racism. It's just racism, however you want to call it, if you distinguish and like treat people differently based on their skin color. And so being a minority in some of these countries that we've traveled to, it's very clear that we experience racism. It's not reverse racism, it's just racism. But the conversation is being had to such an extreme in America because of that kind of guilty white thing that we do in Western society, or liberal white society. We get very guilty about the sins of our relatives or our ancestors. And there's a few points about this. Yeah, I'm going to pause it here because I need to formulate these thoughts. I've got a bunch of notes, though, that I took from today, so maybe I'll put this into a Medium article. But the experience of racism and the experience of feeling white guilt is a very American thing. It's a very American-centric thing.
Or Western-centric.
Yeah. But particularly American.
Yeah.
It's like the Protestant, I mean, we're not there yet in the series, but the Protestant guilt thing that Vervaeke gets to. It's like, I don't know, 5 episodes from now or 6 episodes from now. It's kind of like a modern version of that, I feel like.
It seems like a very surface level thing to like look at a group like this and see white faces and be like, oh, this is not good. We got to do something about this. You know what I mean? Like if this discussion were taking place and we were all Africans, it would be like, would you see in that culture, or whatever culture, I mean, this is a hypothetical culture, but would you see the same kind of guilt about not having a diverse demographic? Like that's what I'm saying. It's kind of a uniquely white thing to have such a huge amount of guilt about being overly represented in a demographic.
I think
It's a
it makes
thing.
a ton of sense though. And I feel like my, a friend of mine who's Indigenous is kind of leaning over my shoulder and whispering in my ear and telling me I have to speak up. There's a big difference between the dominant culture and other minorities in relationship to that culture.
But
And
who's the dominant culture here? That's my question.
Well, that's the thing. White is the dominant culture, right, of the world.
Well, what is
English
white?
But white.
Okay, let's say English-speaking Northwestern European is the historically recently dominant culture
in those
sense.
countries. But when you go elsewhere, it's not like that. That's what I mean. Say it's Western American centric. It's like in those countries, that's the dominant culture. But if I go to Thailand, Thai culture is the dominant culture. It's not. If anything, the way like the Western colonialists have influenced other countries is through capitalism, which is a thing of its own.
Yes.
But
yeah, I'm thinking of it like as a Canadian, right?
Yeah.
That I'm part of a culture that's settled here and is completely decimated the existing cultures. And so there's a reason there is a discomfort about not excluding is the wrong word. There's a reason for a discomfort about missing voices in a conversation, and it's because historically my culture has excluded other voices, including women, deliberately from conversations. And so there's an extra level of sensitivity about reincorporating those voices now, whereas other the groups which my culture has historically suppressed and excluded have not historically and suppressed and excluded me, right? My ancestors, they were the victims of my ancestors.
But my question to you would be, is that your culture, the culture you're referring to?
I want us to break
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, exactly. There's something that feels like this is at a propositional layer that is speaking about things that aren't as deep as they could be. There's something in it that is wider than this. And I notice in myself some sense of anxiety or defensiveness about certain things. It's like, oh, what's that? What is that in me?
Yeah, I defer to you if you want to take it in a different direction.
Well,
actually, we are heading to an.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, I think it is. Like I when I brought it up, I thought it was a bit much for us to be able to include at the tail end of the call.
Yeah.
I think it's probably a kind of a good breaking point, but it's a very interesting perspective. I think especially as I think one of the reasons this comes up is because in whatever way that a colonial expansionist culture and any of that has been very influential in the world mind, the collective intelligence, the existence of the internet and the ability for us to have these conversations and know people around the world is challenging that. So in some way, there's something of the collective mindset that is very fragile at this point. It's toppling, right? And I think that's where my defensiveness is rooted, is like noticing there's something about that is honoring something of that does need to be dropped. Is there a way that I can turn into that suffering and myself and others and find a commonality there that can allow me to become less oppositional and more opposable in working with?
Yeah, just like another version of the same fragmentation. You just fragment everything, because you can fragment. Like I asked, like, what is white, right? It's like, well, you can fragment that all the way down. It keeps going and going. You can get like a DNA test and go down to the levels and go further and further back where you go, okay, well, it's not quite that. It's like at a cultural level. I think John talks about in the series, he talks about like, what is England, right? Where it's like, England is a country. It's not just the area of land. It's like, it's also like an economy. It's also like a culture. It's also like, you can't really pin it. You can't really pin it down. So I guess it becomes more about the way it just comes back to the frame, right? And where Stephen asked us to break the frame, it's like we're the way in which we're framing these things, trying to frame put our attention on that aspect rather than any other aspect. We kind of get pigeonholed into it and can't get out of it, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd say that one of the things in thinking about McGilchrist's book, in McGilchrist's book, and the idea of the hemispheric things, specifically in the split brain patients, where that what happens when you split the hemispheres is two personalities really develop. One side doesn't express itself as much because we use language so much, but it almost as if that bridge between them is what allows it to cohere into an apparent coherent view. And something about culture is the same way, even though it has very much a very deep multiple perspectives in it. There is something of the averaging or the collective that does have a quality to it. So it's an interesting notion of how to dance with that, how to allow that to divide and something new to be born in the ashes of that particular frame.
Yeah.
It's, you know, I say it's very interesting. It's difficult to think about this in one way, and it's almost too late to go into it. I like Mike. I think I'm going to sit on this and work on it a bit more.
I think one skill worth developing as a practice is determining in oneself when one is operating from a place of philonaikia versus philosophia, to use the jargon.
So, can I try and do a little short post-mortem here? Is the discomfort coming from a place of recognizing that we're playing a kind of simulated game here, like simulated thinking of what it's like to be another race, or to maybe I was speaking for someone else? Yeah, well, I'm looking for where the discomfort is. Trying to understand.
I'd say that I would say there's something very subtle about that. That is, in the way, and this is my own thought on this. And everyone suffers from some kind of trauma. My sense is our sense of trauma is in part in learning a language and learning to our culture enculturate us into using a left brain having mode way of thinking about the world. And there's a level of trauma that's there for me as well. And as much as I'm traumatized by it, it also benefits me. So I am in a weird position of having both of those. So there is something in me that wants to empathize with others who are oppressed by this way of thinking, because I feel it too. It's just like, it's kind of disingenuous to say that I'm suffering in the same way, but it's almost impossible not to think that to some extent.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a really complicated thing.
Yeah, David, I like what you said earlier about now about like your own suffering and how it could be disingenuous to say that you're experiencing the same suffering. But I think something that's valuable that I think about a lot and like with other groups that I'm a part of is this kind of concept of that I think is relevant here of intergenerational suffering and intergenerational trauma, in that if we're bringing it, thinking about from a context of purely race, and that's very simplifying of it, but like, one group oppressing another group. Well, this one group that was oppressed feels that pain down the line. Their parents taught that them, and their grandparents and their grandparents. But the group that did the oppressing, through our cultural and social and conscious change, realizing that that's not correct. Like me coming from an English background and the English being colonializing of lots of places, feel that like the responsibility, and like Mike said, like this impulse to have this like white guilt. But I think that it's very valuable, like you said, David, to bring it deeper, like bring it away from this peripheral, very surface level discussion of race and bring it to like, okay, well, why does this matter so much to us? Why do I feel this so deep? And why do you feel this, And I think it definitely, in my frame and my understanding of it, it comes from generations, passed down from my family. Like my personal culture background, I have family that's from England and Germany, but I also have family from Ireland. And like, it's just a very weird combination of ancestors that were the oppressors as well as the oppressed. And I think it's our interactions, let me try to phrase it correctly, like the networking webs of people and collective consciousness that we have, I feel like we simultaneously feel the oppression and the act of oppressing. And it's very hard to how to deal with both of those conflicting things. They create a lot of, I guess just friction within yourself. At least that's what I feel. I don't know if that kind of answers to that thought, but that's
yeah, it's actually, I appreciate the depth of that answer, because it is something that's obviously very not apparent to me. The kind of both genetic and cultural passing down of that collective racial trauma is something obviously there's no experience of.
But I actually liked Austin's point that looking at generational, and I think of the boomer millennial tension is another frame on that it's expressing itself in a very similar way, very different, but analogous. right? There's a tension there that has a near warring tone at times, you know.
Yeah.
Okay, boomer.
Exactly.
For me,
It's like, yeah.
the
David, that was funny.
discomfort for me, it just comes from the discussing this without voices of people of color in the conversation.
Right.
It's like if you guys were all talking about women and Yuvi and I weren't here, there's some that can never be a fully realized conversation somehow without the voices of women. And I feel like there's something here that we can talk about it, but we can only have half the conversation, I think, is how I feel.
It's like talking to yourself about it. Like,
yeah,
you can get you can only get so far without getting the input of the other half. You know?
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, this is such a super complex subject. I guess I might be lying to myself, but I'm not here because I'm a white male. I'm here because I'm trying to solve the meaning crisis. And I think it appeals to everyone. Maybe not everyone, and not is comfortable with appearing stupid on streaming YouTube. but I guess it's and I'm serious in this. This is deeply human, a deeply human subject, and I don't understand why it's mostly males here. I really don't. But I will not feel guilty because I'm participating. So I think it's good that we bring this subject up, but let's not get caught in it, I think. And just appreciate that whomever comes into this conversation, no matter how tall they are, what cultural background or the color of the skin, just appreciate that we are here and try to solve these mysterious, really deep questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well said.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I find this conversation to be so interesting and stimulating, and I love stepping into whatever that discomfort is, no matter what it is. And I think you guys make good points in saying that it's underrepresented and there's only so far we can take it. And it would be interesting to continue it at another point. And the reason for the interest is really just seeing so much of online conversation coming back to this and seeing not a lot of resolution. And what I'm mostly interested in, which is why at the beginning of this I was saying like, oh, I don't like these conversations because I so far feel like it's unanswerable to know what should be done about it. And that it's just, it feels more productive to just be inviting and just have discussions and not change how you would participate based off of anything, any skin color or anything, which is why I feel like compelled to jump into this.
Or if it is changing, to call it to attention.
Pardon me?
I said, or if it is changing, to call it to attention, and then you can address it.
Yeah.
It goes back
and
to
one of the
propositional mode versus participatory mode. Like if we're just discussing this, as a theoretical thing and like what should be done about it, should is kind of a dirty word sometimes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, we can just practice being good people and being inviting.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I agree definitely with Yuvi is like the thought of, and with Mike, you saying like, the best thing I think we can do from my point of view is be inviting and also understand the history and act how you want the future to be. Like if you don't want these types of conversations to continue, if you don't want to, or I guess not even these conversations to continue, but like this, the deep core of it is like racism and unacceptance or, not accepting of others. I think the best way to do that is to be accepting and act acceptingly. Yeah. Stand up for people who are being oppressed, or just be that ally, and then otherwise just be accepting and do your thing.
Yeah. Cool.
There's another real quick, just last thing. This is provocative at the edges. So one of the things that mentally I do already is think how wide can I carry this, and part of it is looking at the assumptions that get questioned when I think about artificial intelligence as opposed to human intelligence. And I've mentioned it before somewhere that Stuart Russell wrote a book recently on Human Compatible is the name of the book. And he's an AI researcher who's actually deeply in AI research and talked about the ethical issues. One of the things that he says and he hints at, and other people have said as well, is whatever we do with AI, we need to make sure it incorporates human values. And I think, oh, that's really interesting. From one level, I can see as a human, that makes a lot of sense. But if I were to ask collectively all the other species on the planet, should we make sure that AI has human values? It might get a different answer. So there's something of the implicit bias that's almost impossible to see around, but it's useful to use that broad perspective to say, I have a blindness here that is almost impossible to see unless I really challenge the frame at a very deep level.
Yeah, and I mean, I think for me that brings up thoughts of like collective intelligence and things that we've been talking about. And like the question that came to my mind when you said that, David, was what are human values? Like we haven't, I think, at a very large collective level determined explicitly what our human values are, A, but B, yeah, the blindness that comes from what are our human values and how do those negatively impact the broad spectrum of the rest of the planet and universe that we live in. Like so that's all I have to say about that.
Any other thoughts before we close off here? And I do appreciate you guys sticking through it. We're almost 2 hours in, so it's awesome we didn't see any drop off here. Anything else?
I think I feel, after hearing Austin, I feel clear on my discomfort in this call, which is the frame, like, I can phrase it correctly, and that will be sufficient. Like, that's, I think, the thing that I want to challenge in myself.
Can you expand on that?
Not at the moment. I think I just got to feel into it more.
I think, Stephen, if I heard you correctly, what you're saying is there's an assumption that if you could phrase it correctly, that would be sufficient. And the thought is, there's a doubt that actually would be sufficient. So there's there's something like, oh, I think I can rely on the propositional at some level. And you think, I don't think that's true based on what I've witnessed so far.
Yeah.
Interesting.
My girlfriend, sorry.
No,
I was just going to say.
Yep. Please.
I was going to say my girlfriend and I have conversations all the time because she's always very adamant against the idea of intentions matter. But I'm always coming from the point of, well, intentions do matter but they just have to be the correct intention. Like if your intention is, like you may have conflicting intentions. And if your intention is to improve as a human being, you're going to come to resolve the necessary internal conflicts. And yes, there's something to be said about problems that things that you may cause, problems you may cause or whatever. But the idea is there's a difference between murder and manslaughter for a reason, right? Like there's a reason we distinguish between these things. Like intentions do matter because it's how else do we change,
Yeah, I appreciate that.
I think something important happened in the group today. I think we all could sense it in the beginning, like this is a pivotal point and the chapter where we talk about the parasitic processing and the downward spirals we've all been through, and it challenges us, and that's why we are almost up to 2 hours now, and the discussion will continue. So I very much appreciate all the input today. It's been deeply valuable, but something happened today in the group.
Cool.
Yeah, I would agree. There was definitely like a moment where it was this conversation and we were like going, and then something just clicked and we were all like, oh, this is like different. It was, yeah. I saw that as well.
Yeah. I'm going to rewatch this.
Yeah, tell us your insights afterwards.
Yeah, I will. Cool. See you guys. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
See y'all next week.
Yep. See ya.
Yeah, this, have you seen this chart here? It's
Just one sec, I have to make sure we're not streaming.